Greetings, folks. Welcome to Mindful MX365. I'm Justin McBride, and this is the daily series where we consider quotes, concepts, and contradictions that support us on our journey of experiencing life mindfully. Today's consideration: what can tomatoes teach us about life? Before we get into today's consideration, let's practice a few intentional breaths. Today, I'm going to keep my eyes open. I'm going to find something in the room, off in the distance, that I can gently focus on as I take each intentional breath, pausing in between each in-breath and each out-breath. Breath in and out. Breath in and out. Let's do a couple more on our own. A reminder of today's consideration: what can tomatoes teach us about life? Now, this is a consideration that I thought up myself. Maybe somebody else has thought of this, but it entered my mind earlier today, actually, as I was staring at a tomato, and I found a fun metaphor, I guess you could call it, in what is the tomato. Now, when we think about a tomato, you might think, oh, it's a fruit that let's pause there. Some of you probably just said, wait, fruit? I thought it was a vegetable. Well, enter our first opportunity to learn something from a tomato. Is it a fruit? Is it a vegetable? Well, in the produce aisle and in the way that we use tomatoes and how the world interprets tomatoes, there's a little bit of confusion. Some see it as a fruit, some see it as a vegetable. There are the scientific classifications and the more colloquial classifications. And I think that's pretty similar for a lot of us. How the world sees us, it varies, right? Some people see us in one light, some people see us in another light. And how they see us is not necessarily a judgment on them or ourself. It is something that is, right? And by being aware of how we see ourselves and how others see ourselves can be incredibly valuable. It can also be anxiety inducing sometimes. I'm not advocating to always think about what others think of you, but I think it is important to consider how others see you. Because sometimes that's a reflection of what you're putting out in the world. Now, there are going to be people that offer their perspective about what they think of you that is not valuable, that is not meant to be helpful. It's meant to hurt. And it's okay to take some of those or take all of those when you recognize that they are not beneficial and they have no intention to be beneficial, and kind of chuck those out the window. But for those perspectives that are coming from a place of wanting to help us, or from people that we respect, people that we care about, let's think about that a little bit. Why are people seeing us a certain way when maybe we see ourselves in another light? And whether or not the tomato is a fruit or a vegetable, at the end of the day, isn't really that important, right? It's what the tomato is able to do in its existence that matters. The exact classification or label of it is not really that relevant. It's the nutritional content that it provides that is more valuable. Let's shift our focus a little bit and consider how the tomato is presented to the world, which tends to be in a way that is a little sweeter or more palatable than it is in its raw sense. Maybe there's sugar or some kind of alternative sweetener added, but it tends to have some other components when it's presented to the world, whether that be a spaghetti sauce or ketchup, which has tons and tons of sugar. Whole other topic for another day, probably another channel. But there's lots of things that are added into the tomato to make it more palatable. What's interesting about that is there's different tomatoes that you could pick and choose from. Not every tomato is going to taste exactly the same. Some tomatoes are going to be a little bit sweeter naturally. Some tomatoes are going to be more acidic. Some will have more flesh. Some will be a little more watery. And rather than trying to mask every single tomato into tasting like the same or producing one type of tomato or replicating yourself just like your friends or your coworkers or the rest of the world, recognize that you have your own value, your own flavor, right? And yes, each flavor can be paired with something else to enhance it. However, if we all just simply sit back and act like we are a Roma tomato or a beefsteak tomato, and we're just cut up, sugar's dumped in there, and we all come out tasting exactly the same, that's pretty boring to me. So recognize what kind of tomato you are. And are you perhaps trying to make yourself a little sweeter or more savory in your presentation? Try not to approach that consideration with judgment, though. Just approach it with awareness. When you note that maybe you are putting on a little bit of a front and you are trying to come off a little nicer or a little bit more bold for one reason or another. It's not necessarily good or bad, but if we're not aware of it, how can we truly evaluate what kind of tomato we even are? Thanks for joining me for today's consideration. If you want to keep the conversation going, head on over to www.mindfulx.net. Again, I'm Justin McBride. Remember, mindfulness is only a few intentional breaths away. Let's do a quick body scan and some intentional breathing right now. I invite you to join me. I'll get us started and then you can go on as long as you'd like. Closing my eyes, turning my focus down to my feet, which happen to be planted firmly on the floor. If you're sitting on the ground, maybe your feet are beneath your knees. Maybe you're laying down and you put your legs side by side. That way they're not crossed and constricting any blood flow as we scan all the way through our body. I'm going to focus on each one of my toes, starting with the big toe. And for just a moment, trying to focus on each toe all the way over to the pinky toe. Working my focus up through my ankles and my shins as you scan quickly but without rushing up through your body, ultimately ending up with your focus at the tip of your tongue as you breathe in and feel the air pass into your body and expand your lungs. Breathe in for 5 seconds, hold it for a moment, breathe out for 5 seconds, and pause before repeating this process as long as you like. Breathe in and out. And on your own,